Buonasera, 안녕하세요. Good evening. Today, I'm so honored to have with us a very important scholar and also esteemed guest today, Ross King, Professor Ross King from the University of British Columbia. He's specializing in Korean language and linguistics and philology. He earned his PhD and master's degree in linguistics from Harvard University and his bachelor in linguistics and political science from Yale College. With an academic career spanning over 3 decades, he has made important contributions to Korean linguistics and philology. And he has held various prestigious positions, including director of the Center of Korean Research and head of the Department of Asian Studies at the same university, so the University of British Columbia. He has also served as the chairman of the Center of Korean Studies at the University of London, SOAS. His main research has been supported by numerous awards and fellowships. Among his many honors, he has been recognized with the Prime Minister Award from the Republic of Korea for his contribution to the advancement of Korean language and studies. He also won the annual Literary Translation Prize from the Korean Culture and Arts Foundation. Now I'd like to mention some outstanding publication of the Professor Ross King. A History of Korean Languages. This book is edited by co-author with another Korean scholars named Lee Gi-moon. And the Korean language in America between 17th and 20th century. And very interesting publication titled Dialect, Contact, Convergence, and Divergence in Korean, the case of Koremari. This publication highlights his extensive research and contribution to the field of Korean linguistics and language studies, and his strong dedication to Korean studies and his outstanding academic background makes him a highly respected figure in this field. So I'm very happy. We are so honored to have him here today to share his insight and expertise with us. So now I hand over the floor to Professor Ross King with applause.
Thank you very much, Professor Chung. Thank you all of you for coming here on a nice sunny afternoon when you probably have better things to do. I appreciate the introduction. What I'm presenting to all of you today is in fact has just been published as an article in the June issue of Korean Linguistics. And if anybody's desperate to see a written version of the paper, it's easy for me to share with you because I now have the PDF. But as a short kind of I guess introduction, I started collecting dialect materials from old Korean 할머니s in Tashkent and in Almaty in Kazakhstan and in St. Petersburg in Russia in 1986. And so for about 20 years, I was flying back and forth, mostly to Kazakhstan, to interview mostly old ladies, because they speak it better, old Korean babushki, who still spoke a form of Korean as their first language. And now those kind of speakers are basically gone. I stopped going in 1905 because it was becoming less and less easy to find fluent first speakers of what I call Soviet Korean. But what I'm presenting today is not based on field work, not from interviews with old speakers of the language, but based on written, published materials from the 1920s and 1930s. And so the title of my talk, as you'll see, is Endangered Korean Dialects in the Former USSR and the quote-unquote Soviet Korean that could have been, but as you'll soon come to know, basically was killed. But 150 years of Koremari, which is what they call it in the local dialect, or in standard Korean. Can I see a show of hands? How many of you are learning Korean? Oh, good. Okay. So in standard Korean, it's called Koryo-mal, but they call it Koremari. And I say 150 years because the first records of Koreans crossing the border into the Russian Far East in the area just south of Vladivostok is about 1863. So the Korean language has a long history on Russian territory. Okay, but that's the title of my talk, but the title of the paper that is based on this talk that just came out is a little different, and it's called Another Language That Failed, with a question mark, because I'm not sure. The beginnings of Soviet Korean in the Russian Far East, and it's only going until 1937. Does anybody know why I would have chosen 1937 as the end point? Anybody? I see one person nodding. That's when all of the Koreans in the Russian Far East were deported. They were basically shoved onto freight trains by Joseph Stalin and moved to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And that was essentially the end of a kind of a golden age in some ways, at least for the language. So that's the published title. So I want to talk a little bit about this title first. So why Another Language That Failed? Essentially, the paper is playing off of this paper from 1992 by a scholar by the name of Austin about Soviet Karelian. He called it The Language That Failed and Linguistic Construction. So the Soviet regime had this notion of linguistic construction where they would take a particular ethnic minority and then try to give them and create for them a standardized form of their language so that they could then join in the Soviet project and create a nationalized Soviet culture for themselves and language. And this was especially salient for groups that lived essentially on both sides of the border of with the Soviet Union. So in the case of the Koreans, these Koreans that I've been studying literally walked across the border because there's a short shared border with Russia. And so you've got all these millions of Koreans on one side of the border, and then on the Soviet side, a tiny group of about 120,000 in the 1920s. But there are many such nationalities, and the Soviet state took a very strong interest in these groups. Essentially, the idea was to treat them especially nice on the Soviet side of the border to serve as a kind of beacon of hope for their co-ethnics across the border. So this paper is essentially a kind of case study about one of these ethnic groups that Soviet nationalities policy in essence, experimented with. So another case would be the Moldovans from the state of, or the Republic of Moldova during Soviet times. And what I'm looking at is these explicit, targeted attempts by Soviet power to exploit and enhance linguistic distance, and of course that's very difficult to measure, but we talk about linguistic distance between closely related varieties of the so-called same language. Okay, so Karelian was a form of Finnish, and was different from Standard Finnish that was spoken in Finland. Moldovan was different from Romanian, spoken in Romania. And in the case of Soviet Korean, I'm presenting this study And by the way, some of my colleagues in Korea do not appreciate the approach that I take to this topic because Korean linguistic nationalism is quite strong, and any challenges to the notion that we are all one glorious, happy, homogeneous Korean nation speaking the same Korean language, some of our colleagues in Korea have a problem with that, and I'm trying to challenge that. But in any case, my paper contributes to this idea of what is Soviet Korean, what are the social linguistics and sociology of this particular form of Korean. And so the kinds of questions that I'm talking about in the paper are questions of language and identity, language and colonialism, because during this period, Korea across the border was occupied by Imperial Japan. It was a colony, and that had really quite shall we say, severe consequences for the ability of Koreans in Korea to standardize or codify their own language. This idea of what is comparative standardology, where do standard languages come from, how are they created? A recent term or a recent kind of hot topic in social linguistics is this topic of language making, which I'll come back to later. And then this idea of questions of how do you measure linguistic distance and what is linguistic elaboration, which is a term that has come out of the European Union in the last couple decades as the EU has promulgated certain forms of legislation that make it easier for minority languages to promote themselves, in essence. So it's always good to show some maps when we're talking about these exotic places like the Soviet Union. So here's on the left, you see Finland, and the bits in red were portions of Finland that were ceded to the Soviet Union in 1940, and where this language called Karelian or Soviet Karelian was attempted for a number of years and ultimately failed. And there in yellow in the middle is Moldova, tucked in between Ukraine and Romania, where for quite some decades, quite longer than Soviet Karelian, there was a sort of official Moldovan language written in the Cyrillic script, not in the Latin script, that tried to maintain a kind of distance from Romanian, but that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that project also collapsed. But then if we move to the Far East, this is now we're getting into Korean territory. So you see in the very, you see Najin somewhere here. So this is northeast Korea in North Hamgyong and Hamgyong-pukdo. And then right here is the shared border with Russia. And starting in the 1860s, Koreans started walking across the Tumen River. It would freeze over. And all this area here was predominantly Korean until 1937. And there were other Korean settlements all the way up in here and in other parts of the Russian Far East. The Koreans were essentially the grocers or the greengrocers for the Russian Far East. They grew a lot of the vegetables and produce for the Far East while they were still there. So that's our border. And then to drill a little bit deeper, this is Hamgyong-namdo, South Hamgyong province, and Hamgyong-pukdo. And right up here, then area number 1 is a really interesting region. It's the most remote, out-of-the-way, kind of backwards region in Korea, very mountainous. That's called the Kukjin region. There used to be 6 fortresses there that were created in the 15th century as a kind of bulwark against marauding Jurchen peoples. And the very first Koreans to go with Russia, not surprisingly, came from up here. And this region happens to preserve a very, very conservative, shall we say, archaizing dialect that counts as a kind of 7th, interesting dialect of Korean. And then after they first went across, then mostly they came from this area, North Hamgyong. So my point being that most of the Koreans that call themselves Koryo Saram have roots in North Hamgyong province. Not even South Hamgyong, from North Hamgyong. They have a very specific regional imprint on their language. And we'll come back to some examples of that. So that's a potted kind of overview of the emigration history from Korea. So, and then I'm still kind of building up to the point here. When we talk about these ethnic or national minorities in the Soviet Union, we can't do so without making reference to this particular book. Professor Terry Martin is a professor at Harvard University. He's a Soviet historian. And back in 2001, he wrote this book called The Affirmative Action Empire, and where he talks about Soviet nationalities policy in exactly the same period, basically under Lenin and under Stalin, 1920s, 1930s. And so he sets out this notion that Soviet policy had kind of 4 pillars. And with every single national minority in the Soviet Union, the Soviet state endeavored to do 4 things for them: to give them a national language, to create for them a national elite by training them and giving them higher education, to create for them a national culture, and, in theory, to give them also a national territory, usually in the form of a so-called, what do they call it, like an independent or autonomous oblast or something like this. They would give them an autonomous territory where they had some form of local government autonomy, but were still, of course, subject to the laws of the Soviet Union. And the Koreans in the Russian Far East at least got 3 out of 4. And so there were definitely attempts to create a national language for the Koreans. Definitely there was a national elite that was created, although most of it was purged by 1938. Most of them had either been shot and killed or else put in the Gulag. They also had a national culture. What they didn't have, but they were lobbying for, was their own autonomous zone right across the border. And that was a very sensitive topic. So other points that he makes in this important book, he talks about the Piedmont Principle as being, for a number of years, a key objective of Soviet nationalities policy, namely the Soviet attempt to exploit cross-border ethnic ties to project political influence into neighboring states. So this is this idea that I mentioned earlier of the Soviets treating the Koreans on their side of the border very nicely and very kind of ostentatiously to kind of show to the Koreans across the border, look, it's so much better here in Russia. You know, you guys should come over, or you should embrace the communist revolution, this kind of thing. And this happened in many different places with many different ethnic groups. A couple other points he makes is that when you're talking about Soviet nationalities policy in the 20s and 30s, is that there's a big difference between the center, which is Moscow, and the periphery. And where we are in the Russian Far East is very periphery. It's very far away from Moscow. I forget how many time zones, but it's probably, I don't know, at least a dozen, maybe 16 time zones, I'm not sure. It's very far, especially back in that time. So the center did not necessarily know what was happening or have a lot of control over what was going on the periphery. And then the other point he makes is that what the hardline bureaucracies were doing was very different from what the softline bureaucracies were doing. So the hardline bureaucracy would be what? Can anybody give me the prime example of a Soviet hardline bureaucracy? Anybody? I saw a hand. No? Well, who arrests you if they don't like you in Russia? The KGB, right? Which used to be called the NKVD. So, I mean, the security apparatus was the hardline apparatus. And they always trumped the softline bureaucracy when push came to shove. So NKVD, security apparatus, the military, that's your hardline. Softline bureaucracies, the ones doing education, the ones doing language planning, the ones helping with cultural sort of development, they sort of did their own thing, were happily carrying on with their jobs until at one point it all stops, and then either the military or the NKVD says, okay, that's enough, we're deporting you. That's what we need as background for the Koreans. So the question that I'm trying to answer with this paper is, Was there such a thing as a Soviet Korean language? And again, my colleagues in Korea who are in so-called national language studies, or Kugohak, which is a very conservative and very nationalist field, the question for them is already a kind of bogus question. They don't like this question. But was there a Soviet Korean language? And I already take the position that if we're talking about spoken Korean, the dialect spoken on the street, that yes, there was, and that it sort of lived, up until basically the 1990s, early 2000s, and now it's moribund. It's kind of a dying language, or a dying variety. But if there was such a language, I'm talking about written language now. So this paper is about written sources, what it looks like on the written page, like a standardized language. If there was such a thing, what were its characteristics? How was it different from standard, so-called standard Korean across the border? Right? And if there was it by design, or was it just kind of happenstance? Was it an accident of on-the-ground policy? So those are kind of the questions that I will try to come back to at the end. All right, so was there a Soviet Korean language? What kinds of sources can we use to answer the question? Well, the first kind would be published materials in Korean from the Russian Far East. And there are quite a few of these. A second form would be meta-linguistic or meta-pragmatic statements about the Korean language and Korean language policy by Soviet Koreans themselves. So basically Koreans in the Russian Far East writing articles, whether in Russian or in Korean, about the situation, those kinds of statements. What did they themselves say? We also have some of these from the Korean newspapers. And then finally, there's data from living speakers. That's what I'm not talking about here. That's spoken, that's dialect work. I'm not talking about that today. That's a totally different question. And there, I think the answer, in my view, is unambiguously, yes, there was a Soviet Korean language, and it was really interesting. So, if you're talking about a language, well, you need to look at a number of different characteristics. I'm not going to give a very detailed linguistic kind of lecture. But you're going to look at the phonetic features. You're going to look at the phonological features. You need to look at the morphosyntax, basically the nuts and bolts, the endings, or the noun, particles, the verb endings that you're all busy learning if you're taking Korean. The lexicon, the vocabulary, and then spelling, orthography. Okay, these are the kind of the four areas that you, if you're talking about a written language, that you would look at to find these characteristics. So the first thing I have to say is that there are a number of features from this list of 4 different kinds of characteristics that are not necessarily unique to the Koreans in the Russian Far East, but statistically more likely to be found there. And so I'm not claiming that there are things that they did in Soviet Korean that are completely unprecedented or unfindable across the border, because it is, after all, a form of Korean. However, so you can find many of the features I'm going to show you, you can find them across the border in Korea itself, but they're found in greater abundance, with greater frequency, statistically, more often in the Soviet Korean materials. And there are many of these localizable or sort of regional features that are from Hamgyong, especially North Hamgyong province. And many of these other features co-occur with these regional features. Furthermore, all of these features that I'm going to show you, they co-occur with Russian loanwords. There's tons, as you would imagine, tons of Russian loanwords in these materials. And in addition to just other vocabulary that's very specific to Soviet political culture. And as an anecdote, I should say, when I first went to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, I happened to go for a long period of time, for about 9 months, with my wife, who is a Seoulite. She's Korean, born and raised, educated in Seoul through university, who didn't speak Russian. And we would meet these Koreans, and they would try to communicate with my wife in Korean, and they couldn't. I had to serve as interpreter because I knew the dialect and I knew Russian, and where it always broke down in both areas, so that basically an educated Seoul speaker had great difficulty communicating with a Soviet Korean babushka and vice versa. That's sort of, and it took several weeks of mutual accommodation for there to be at least some basic communication, but it would always break down because of the Russian vocabulary. So, I mean, that's just sort of anecdotally a way to think of what happened at the spoken language level. All of what my point, the point I'm trying to make here is that all of these various features, when you combine them together into one bundle, they make for a very distinctive constellation of features that you can't find on the Korean Peninsula, and so that therefore that is moving in the direction of divergence and of creating a new variety or a new language. And then the question is, well, when do you say it's a new language? And we'll come to that. So I'm making the point, I'm claiming, and my colleagues in Korea hate this, I'm saying that there was such a thing as Soviet Korean, not just in terms of the spoken language and sort of how they talked on the street, but it was crystallizing on the printed page, and that you could actually spot it from a mile away. And so I'll show you some examples, and you can tell me if you agree. So this is an example of these, there were at least 7 or 8 newspapers published in Korean in the 1920s and 1930s. This is the major one. It was called Sunbong. So you can see it spelled up here in this kind of funky linearized Hangul. And then you've got Hanja. They used Hanja in most of their sinographs in their publications. And of course, you've got the Russian title as well, Avant-Garde. And this shows a couple Soviet Korean farmers holding in their hands the compass, which of course is their newspaper, Sunbong. And off in the distance, it looks like the shining kind of, what is it, Emerald City in the Wizard of Oz. You know, this is the great Soviet future that towards they're heading. And can anybody read what the yellow brick road says? Anybody figure that out? Anybody want to guess from our Korean students? Leninjury, Leninism, yeah? Leninjury, yeah. So of course Leninism was what was going to lead them to the brilliant future, which of course is very heavily mechanized. So that's typical. I mean, you don't have to look at the actual specific language just yet. Most of what shows up in these newspapers is terribly, terribly boring translations from Pravda, from the Russian newspaper. Here's another one from the same newspaper, 1927. You can see the date up on the top left in Hanja. And Uri Shinmun, and again a couple Korean farmers, happily reading the 200th issue of this newspaper. So this is one primary source, but in some ways not the most interesting. The more interesting kind of source is the textbooks that we have that they used. It was quite a large network of ethnic Korean schools for communities that had a majority Korean population. So let's see, this is typical 1926, 새 독본 붉은 아이. Although if you were a speaker, you would pronounce it 붉은 아이. Our speakers roll their R's, which no other Koreans do in that environment. The spelling is still kind of old. And they're spelling the Hanja kind of like the way they do in North Korea today. It's a specific decision about how to spell the pronunciations of words that are based in Hanja, right? So they're writing roryok, but they're not pronouncing it that way. But they're spelling it that way. Again, this is kind of an old spelling, 제1권, 제1편, with the tigut. You see the tyo이. The speakers from Kukjin, the very northernmost region that I showed you, they pronounced it that way. But the rest didn't. They would just pronounce it che like we do, like che ilguan. So this is just sort of simple just to give you an idea what some of the sources are. There's about maybe 40 textbooks that were used, that were printed, that survived, and which I've managed to collect. And you see down below at the very bottom, it tells you where this was published. There are 2 cities. On the left, can anybody see what the city on the left is? It's kind of hard to see. Khabarovsk, right? So Khabarovsk, right? How about on the right? So you've got a P-up with a 동그라미, right? There's a little circle and a P-up. That's a V, right? So this is Vladivostok, and you've got La has 2 reals. Pretty funky spelling. So they worked out a way to spell Russian words using Hangul, which is kind of cool and kind of different. Another one, this is a teacher's manual. So this is for the teachers teaching in the schools. And the most obvious feature would be that they're using Hanja, right? And then many of these textbooks are kind of fun because they give illustrations from daily life. So this, and some of these, this is before 1930. So Kongnisha is the local, how many hands, show of hands, how many of you studied Russian? No, okay, yay, okay. So this is the magazine. The magazine is Kongnisha, and they wrote with this funny sha. It's an old spelling. This one's also, for those of you learning Korean, it says, so it's about the local village store. 사려 오는 사람과 팔려 오는 사람이 많다. If you guys do that on your test next week, you'll get marked off, right? Because that's not standard, yeah? It should be, if it was today, it'd be 사러 오는 사람, okay? So slightly different morphology. 남자들도 있고 여자들도 있다. So this is this kind of, it looks almost like North Korean spelling now. So it's conservative spellings for Hanja words. And then here's another weird one. So 월남이네는 곡식을 싣고 왔다. So this is 싣다, 싫어요. Modern would be to load, but the spelling is odd because they pronounce it this way. They say 싣고 온다. And then the spell like 오왔다, nobody spells like that, right? They're keeping the verb stem separate from the ending. Just one S, it's not a typo, this kind of thing. So little things like this here and there sort of kind of strike you. So then these textbooks also made a point of showing how terrible life was across the border under Japanese rule. So here you have Koreans being beaten up for, protesting against Japanese rule. So we can read the whole thing from the top, right? So 고려는 저 남쪽에 있다. So because they're up north, right? 우리 부모들의 옛 나라이다. So again, old spelling, but this is not Hancha, this is Old Korean. So it's got the N, which doesn't, now it's yet, right? So it's got kind of archaic spellings. 고려의 땅은 살기 좋지만, yeah, good place to live, but 일본의 자본가들이 차지하였다. These Japanese, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Capitalists have occupied it. Yeah? 고려의 농민과 노동자들은 먹을 것, 입을 것. Yeah? That's Old Korean. Yeah? It's also dialect, but it's also an old spelling. 살 곳도, final tigut, all weird stuff. You don't see this, and you wouldn't see this in across the border at this time either. It'd be odd. So these kind of things. And then here's another textbook. I think it's meant to be a song. 세상이 캄캄하더니, the world was so dark. But then 새 빛이 비추도다. Now there's this new light shining. Of course, it's communism. 눌리던 자 일어나. Old spelling. Yeah, that's old. And then 제 권리를 찾노라. 모든 원한 씻으려. This is dialect. Yeah, it's be modern, be 씻으러. And then these are the kind of most blatant dialect ones. 외로운 싸움. I can't see what the rest of it says. 싫었다. So 외로운 싸움. 외롭다 외로운. Yeah, they don't. So when you learn Korean, you learn that's 덥다, 더워요. Yeah, the P, W, irregular verbs. In this dialect, the P never changes, okay? And they spelled like this. So why did they do that? Well, presumably because it sounded more, well, there are various reasons, but nobody spelled like this in Korea. It was very unusual. So not 외로운 사람, they wrote 외로운 사람. Lenin-tang, there's Lenin again, double real. Yeah, yeah. But then down at the bottom, little footnote. 한자, 신차, the new character, double L, 는 우리말에 아니 쓰임. This is not used in Korean. It's not used in our language. So, they were making these kind of, I guess, orthographic decisions as they went along. Yes, many of these textbooks focus on girls and on girls' education because there was this kind of push to get the Koreans to send their girls to school because traditionally they didn't go to school. So here's 어머니가 다리고, just a picture of a mother taking her daughter to school. And then you'd have these kinds of texts which essentially show how great things are in the Soviet Union, where everything is mechanized, industrialized, and as opposed to the traditional life ways. So the things in red are just kind of words that you would not see in Korea. Let's go. But where's my? Over here. 봄에 련씨를 심고. So this is 심다 심어요. In the spring, they plant something, but there's not a single Korean who can tell you what 련씨 is. 모르시죠? 련씨. It's Russian. It means flax. It's a Russian word. But if you're in Russia, you'd know it. And so, and then 가을에 막 뽑아서 물에 젖힌다, which we would say as 물에 적신다, to make it all wet. And then 그다음 말리워서, to dry it. But then, again, they put kind of different endings on their verbs or different. So these are all, you can just go through any text and start marking things like these are all bits and pieces that wouldn't happen in Korean, written Korean across the border, including Russian, including dialect, including different spellings, including different morphology. So this is another cute letter. So I mentioned there was this focus on women. There was also this focus on literacy, because most of the Koreans in the Soviet Union, they were farmers, they were illiterate. Just as most of the Koreans in Korea across the border were illiterate. Just because they had Hangul doesn't mean that they knew how to read. And so this is, I don't know if you can see it, I can read it for you. It says, 48살에 처음 문맹 퇴치소에서 공부하는 여자 리 바르바라가 국제 여자대회를 맞으면서 본사에 보낸 글. This is a letter from Lee Varvara, from Varvara Lee, sent to the newspaper after she had completed the crash course in literacy at the local sort of literacy training center. As her first letter she'd written in Hangul to the newspaper, blah, 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 at the age of 48. 48살, right? So also slightly different. And then things about their traditional life ways. Chimche would be what? Kimchi. It's the dialect word. That's their word for kimchi. It's a Chinese word originally. 침체를 담으오. So this is dialect stuff. So 침체를 담으오. 어머니는 배채와 물을 씻소. Yeah, a different verb stem shape. 아주머니는, we would say 아주머니, but this is 아주머니는 마늘과 고초를 써. 영순이는 배채속을 먹소 등등. These are really cute textbooks. Of course, they're almost impossible to find because most of them were destroyed at the time of the deportation. So I submit to you that Soviet Korean had a pronounced regional flavor, which was hamgyong, that it also had an orthography that was distinct from that that was used in Korea itself. And of course, for the longest time in Korea itself, the orthography was also not standardized. So for those of you who have learned about this, the Choseonho Hakkwae, the Hangul Hakkwae, did promulgate the orthography that we all use now, but it was very radical. And it ran into a lot of opposition, and that was only in like 1933 when they actually promulgated it. So there's not a lot of standardization in Korea at this point either. So some of the things they did was that they would take the verb stem and always keep it separate from the of oyo, ayo. All right? And so like an example here would be 자빠졌다, which we can say to fall over, but they would spell it with a sang piup downstairs. I can show it to you right there. That's like, you can't even get this in a Korean word processor. You can't type this using Microsoft Word because it's such a weird spelling, right? But anyway, they could print it. That's how they did that. I just showed you this lack of so-called piup. There's no piup irregular verbs in their spelling or in their dialect. So they would spell turyobun instead of what we would say is turyoun. Okay. They would write mushobun where we would say musoun. Yeah. They would write tobi instead of what we would say is toi. All right. And then they did this weird thing. Oh, it didn't come out right in on this computer. So for 길다, 긴 것, something long, they wrote kiok, i, real, nian together to kind of like remind you that there was a real that used to be there. Never did they do this in Korea. They're like really wacko. And so this is what they did with these L extending, like 길다, 잘다. They would when they did the modifier form, they would put that real nian in there. Very strange. So let's see. Does anybody want to read the text on the left? Do I have a volunteer to read it out loud? I think you're going to. Can I, with the glasses, the white glasses? No, yes, you, sir. Yes. No? Give it a try. 천지다. 토. 마사진다. 거의. Yeah, it's okay. 죽어간다. 잘 읽었습니다. Yeah, very good. So, kolhoz would be a kolhoz. So that's a Russian word. So then, 크어간다, they're getting bigger. Yeah, what a strange spelling. We don't spell it like that. They take the stem, put it over here, put the all here. They spell it 크어간다, but they pronounce it 커간다. 마소도 불어난다. So we're getting lots of 말과 소. 모도 기계천지다. It's a paradise of machines. Yeah. 토호가 뭘까? These are I don't think we have this in standard Korean. These are the kulaks. These are the rich peasants, the ones that the Soviet regime was busy exterminating. So the kulaks, they're contracting. 그 살림은 마사진다. Their way of life is being destroyed. We would say 부서진다. So this dialect. 거의 죽어간다. They're pretty much almost dead. Yeah. So in the bottom for the kids, 수수께끼. Yeah. 수수께끼 would be a riddle. Yeah. 농촌에서 남의 등에 살던 배 뚱뚱이 무엇이냐? So who are the fatsos? Who are the fat slobs that live off the backs of the farmers in the village? And the answer is toho, the kulaks. Okay, so these are the kind of texts that kids were learning from. And then on the right, kolhoz 농사. So this is farming on a kolhoz. kolhoz 농사는 새 기계로 한다. 개인 농사는 낡은 기구로 한다. We do it with old machines in the individual farming. kolhoz 살림은 크고도 잠이 있다. For 잠이 있다. What we would say is 개인 살림은 작고도 서글프다. We don't have this word, meaning like 서운하다, 서글프다. And then another 수수께끼. 기름만 먹고 일하는 것이 무엇이냐? Anybody want to guess? The pictures are right there staring you in the face. 기름만 먹고 일하는 것이 트랙터다. It's a tractor, okay? So again, this infatuation with machinery. So 1930 comes along and this book comes out. It's by Oh Chang-hwan is the author up top. It's all in Hanja. Oh Chang-hwan was executed sometime around 1937. Brilliant guy. He's clearly very smart, but like anybody who was arrested and shot by the security forces, when they execute you, they destroy all of your possessions. So we don't have any of his papers or anything. The book is called Koryo Munjan. This is a grammar of Koryo Mal. So I see this as the kind of declaration of divorce with Korean from across the border. This is very explicitly calling their language by a different name and giving it its own grammar. Okay. So in this book, so that this is this question of what is language naming and what is language making. So this new field I mentioned that's getting a lot of kind of buzz right now is of language making. Makes a big deal out of this notion of naming. Like if a group of speakers calls the language they speak something different, then something important is happening. Okay, they're declaring some form of divorce. So yeah, linguistic declaration of divorce and of independence. And so other obvious parallels are Azerbaijan Dili, which is basically just Turkish, okay, but or Tajiki, which is basically just Persian. Yeah, but these are the Soviet versions of it. Okay, I mean obviously they're not 100% the same, but they are mutually intelligible. So in this grammar, this Oh Chang-hwan wrote this grammar. He says, written materials in Korean language research which come in from either Korea or from Chinese territory, and he lists a bunch of titles that are known books. These are known grammars. He says, they're useful, but none of them is appropriate for us in Korean education here in the Soviet Far East. So again, a kind of declaration of independence. So that's one thing that happens around 1930. Right at this point in time, for about 10 years, another kind of pan-Union, pan-Soviet movement takes place, and it's the Latinization movement, which says, you know what? We're going to give every single language in the Union a new writing system based on the Latin script. Not Cyrillic, because to do it in Cyrillic would be, It'd be kind of chauvinistic. It would be too Russo-centric. And so this is a poster from Uzbekistan for the Uzbek Latinized alphabet. But Korean also was going in this direction, but got a late start. But before we get to it, in 1930, this gentleman called Bulatnikov, who claimed to be some sort of cultural commissar, wrote this article in 1930 where he says, quote, "There live in the Far East a number of nationalities whose writing systems are an obstacle to their culture and political development. The Koreans living in the Soviet Union, just like those living on the other sides of these borders, have their own writing system based on the Chinese hieroglyphs," which of course is nonsense. It's not true. Hangul is not based in hieroglyphs. But the perception was that you couldn't write Korean without Hanja. This was the perception. And Koreans themselves in the Russian phrase had this idea that, you know what, we really can't write our own language without Hanja. We somehow need them. So this Bulatnikov says, therefore, we need to Latinize Korean too. So this is actually the one and only source ever published, 1932, of Korean written in a new Latinized script. And this is, it's too, I won't pick on anybody, this is really bizarre. So here's the author, Oh Sung-muk, that's his name, Oh Sung-muk. And then the title of the book is Latin화한 고려 글. It ends in an R. And remember, the pachim real in this dialect is pronounced as r, as a tap or a flap, right? So koryo kur, which worked kind of well. 첫 걸음, first steps in Latinized Korean. And then in parentheses, 차라니의 for adults, for 차라니, okay? And then down at the bottom, it's the 새 글자 for meaning writing system. 새 글자 전동맹, the all-union alliance for the new alphabet for Latinization. So this is Oh Sung-mook, who look at the year he died. So he was also one of the people who was rounded up by the NKVD, arrested and shot. He was one of the editors of Sunbong newspaper, and he somehow managed to get this manual published in Moscow. It was the only, like I say, it didn't take off, but nonetheless, there were Koreans advocating for getting rid of Hangul and writing the Korean language in Latinized. So it's not like Romanization. It's not an auxiliary thing. It's like, no, get rid of Hangul. Of course, they didn't use the word Hangul. They called it Koryokur. Get rid of Koryokur and write in Latin Hangul. So here's the textbook. So you get this kind of preamble that for the teachers as to how to teach it. And then you have a simple reader for how to start reading Korean in Romanized script. So to have a volunteer for this first page. Don't be shy. Take a wild guess, anybody. No? Who is that? Please, go ahead. Kaul, 그다음? Yes? Kokshik kaul, yeah, because they're harvesting grain, right? So it's the harvest, kaul. Kaul il, but sorry, kaur and ir, because this dialect always rolls the R's, okay? So that's why they chose the R instead of writing an L. So now we get brigade. So they don't write the for the minimal vowel. They just brigade, which makes it great for writing Russian words, right? Brigade, 우리 brigade, 두 brigade, brigade가 일한다. 곡식을, sorry, 빈다. So this is now we're cutting the grain within their brigade, right? On the right, there we have a kolhoz again, yeah? Kolhoz. Again, they don't write the kolhoz, but now you can write it's a good way to incorporate international vocabulary from Russian into the language. 우리 kolhoz 농사, kolhoz maso, the cattle. kolhoz brigade가 마소를 먹인다. Right? And so, it goes on and on like this, but again, this is the only thing that was ever published. So, deportation, 1937 in the fall, all the Koreans are rounded up, put on freight trains, and sent on a month-long journey as it's getting cold to Central Asia. 1938, basically across the entire Soviet Union, many of these schools for ethnic languages are phased out. Phased out due to the unanimous requests of parents for Russian. This is what the state said, the request of parents for Russian in their schools. Whether that's true is another question. 1939, all remaining Korean language textbooks, other printed material is pulped, destroyed, because the Koreans were designated as an enemy people, because the excuse given to deport them was that they were a security risk for Japanese espionage. So, at this point in time, most of the intellectuals, the school teachers, the writers, newspaper folks, they are arrested and either executed or put in the gulag. Many are removed from their community. So, what is the end result of all of this? You get linguistic divergence. In the spoken language, big time, because there's no overarching standard for them, even in the written language. In the meantime, there's absolutely no explicit attempt to distance Soviet Korean from Seoul speech. So remember I said they wrote, where we would say 무서운 사람, they wrote 무서운 사람. The textbooks told them to pronounce it 무서운 사람. So it was a spelling thing. They were just focused on always spelling regularly. Even though in their dialect, they pronounced it 무서운 사람, in school they were taught to read 무서운 사람. Just like today in North Korea. In North Korea, they write 녀자, and they pronounce 녀자, but that's not a dialect fact. They're taught to pronounce that way. So there was these weird things going on to what they said, what they spoke in their day-to-day life, and how they were taught to read their spellings. They weren't necessarily the same. So, in fact, the claim is in these textbooks that Seoul Korean was still somehow the standard, which is really strange given the way they spell. Already at this point in time, this has barely been, 15 years? 1922 to 1937, 15 years. You see this kind of divergence in the written language, and in the spoken language, that's amplified big time. So I am of the opinion that Soviet Korean, as of 1937, was on its way to becoming what this scholar Harman calls a Nebensprache, or a Kulturdialekt, or what in French they call a langue voisine, where it's essentially a closely related language that has now started to officially kind of go its own way. And these are a couple of books that came out in recent years about this idea of langue voisine or langue collatérale. On the right about Slavic, and on the left I think it's mostly about France. And then this is another book, this is the Harman book, where he talks about so-called Nebensprachen, or culture dialects. So Afrikaans, Dutch, German, Frisian, these are all really close, but they are acknowledged as being separate languages. And the speakers themselves see what they speak as being a different language, partly because they have a different name. Or Occitan and French, Macedonian, Bulgarian, etc. So I think that the end result of this kind of episode with the Soviet Koreans was a combination of oblivion. It's just been completely thrown off the cliff. A drift, it just kept drifting on its own without any direction, no official standard language. And of course, obsolescence, basically language death. And Soviet Korean today is essentially a moribund language. You can't find fluent first language speakers. You can find some semi-fluent speakers. All of this was accelerated by the lack of Russian or central expertise on Korean language. In most cases in the Soviet Union, when they were doing this kind of local language planning, there was always one or more experts back in Moscow that kind of took control. But there were no experts in Korean language in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. The one expert they had, who was in Vladivostok, literally left town and went to Korea the night before the Bolsheviks entered Vladivostok, because he was an anti-Bolshevik. And so there was nobody, basically no one, everything was just kind of do your own thing. Nobody was in charge except for the local Koreans. And even to this day, there's very little attention by Russian scholars about the Soviet Koreans and their language, because there's not a lot of expertise. And in the Soviet times, it was kind of a taboo topic. If you were a scholar in the Soviet Union and you were a Korean specialist, you only talked about Korea outside of Russia. You didn't talk about Koreans in Russia. There's this cool article by this scholar called Schrad from 2004 about ragdoll nations, where he's talking about Karelia and Moldova, the first two places I started talking about. One near the sort of Finland, and the other in between Ukraine and Romania, where he says these two nations, the Karelians and the Moldovans, these became ragdoll nations, this idea of this doll that a child will play with for a while, it gets all beat up and torn, and then they just toss it away. And that's kind of what happened to some of these ethnic groups under Soviet policy in the 20s and 30s. And so essentially Soviet Korean and Soviet Koreans were a ragdoll nation and a ragdoll language. A couple other points I want to finish with. This episode with Latinization I think is really interesting, because all of you who are learning Korean will have been hit over the head a million times with how fabulous, how wonderful, how scientific the great Hangul alphabet is, and how superior, how usuhe, about the ususung of this and that. There's this entire discourse, this cult of Hangul, what I call a cult of Hangul, which has the effect of occluding all these other interesting things about the language, because the Koreans only want to talk about Hangul. Well, I think this episode shows that, wait a minute, for some Koreans in the Russian Far East in the 1930s, Hangul wasn't so great. They were happy to get rid of it for whatever reasons. I think that's really interesting. But my colleagues in Korea don't like that. I think it also points out for us the really big difference between dealing with spoken language and written language, because in what's called a roofless environment, where there's no overarching standard. So, for example, today in China, in Manchuria, we still have 1.5 million Koreans speaking Korean, writing Korean, and they have a kind of standard overarching them. In the Soviet Union, that disappeared in 1937. It means more increased sort of divergence. And then I want to emphasize that at this point in time, and again, my Korean colleagues, one of the reviewers, one of the anonymous reviewers for this article that finally got published, really objected to this point when I pointed out there was no standard language in Korea itself. And I maintain to this day that Korea has never had unified standard language, because as soon as 1945 happened, North and South, basically went their separate ways. And so to this day, Korea has never had a standard language, and it did not have a standardized language at this time in Korea. And they had made their first steps, but that didn't, it wasn't widely promulgated. They couldn't teach it in schools because the Japanese wouldn't let them, etc. So written Soviet Korean had a different look and feel, is what I am arguing. Was it design or happenstance? It was kind of happenstance. It wasn't planned. It wasn't really a top-down kind of thing. It was, or it was kind of both. It was a combination of, you had these dialect facts on the ground. You had these very peculiar ideas about spelling, which were more ideologically motivated, not like ideology like communism, but ideology, but we should spell this way. And then this idea of the Soviets saying, okay, we want to be different from the people across the border, the Piedmont Principle. So in a way, this was an episode of language making interrupted. They were just getting going on sort of creating something that they could call Soviet Korean, which was going to have its own grammar, which was already published, its own spelling, its own sort of peculiarities, and it was sort of nipped in the bud. So this new book, this new article, it's an article by Kramer et al., defines language making as this: conscious or unconscious human processes in which imagined linguistic units are constructed and perceived as a language, a dialect, or variety. And they put great importance on this idea of glossonyms. What do you call the language? Does it have a name? Attaching labels. And it did. It was called Koryo-o or Koryo-mal. And to this day, if you meet a Soviet Korean who actually, a Koryo saram who speaks it, it's Koremari. That's what they speak. And there were limited codification efforts. And it's important to, I suppose, to emphasize that even today, Korean is in an environment of pluricentricity. There's more than one center of gravity for Korean, because after all, there is a standard North Korean, in addition to the standard Korean from the Republic of Korea in the south. But even at this point in time, we see pluricentricity setting in the 1920s and 30s. So I think that this particular story counts as a kind of new and untold chapter in the history of modern Korean and the history of modern Korean standards. And I think it also, and this is my last point, I think it also kind of, in a backdoor kind of way, reminds us of the linguistic consequences of colonialism, by which I do not mean Soviet internal colonialism with the Koreans in their midst, but I mean Japan, and the fact that because of Japanese colonialism, the Koreans in Korea itself were not able to do the same kinds of codification, standardization, education in their language that the Soviets were actually trying to do with the Koreans in Russia. And so in many ways, Japanese colonialism set back standardization of Korean by a good 40 plus years. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention. So.
Thank you very much. You speak very quickly.
Sorry, I started slow, but I just, yeah.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. And I have some questions, but I'd like to ask our students first. If you have any question, or
There's a
Anna.
question.
Yeah, okay.
That sounds good.
Okay, thank you. First, thank you so much for your lecture. It was very interesting. I just had a question regarding your personal experience towards this study. And I wanted to ask, in your opinion, the fact that you are a non-native speaker of Korean, was it a fact that has made for you easier to study these aspects of the language? Because some days ago I read that non-native English speakers can produce some kind of more unique texts because they can be like write in a more unique way in English because they are not native, so they are not so standardized in the way they express. So I was curious whether, in your opinion, the fact that you are not a native Korean speaker, it has made easier for you to observe these aspects of this language, especially studying from zero Korean and also all the grammatical aspects that you have found.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a really interesting question. In essence, I mean, the bigger question is, how does being a non-ethnic Korean researcher affect your positionality when you're engaging in Korean studies? And it's a very vexed question, especially in fields that have the kuk prefix in front, kuksa, kugo, and kungmun, which are very nationalist in their orientation and very xenophobic. And so what happens is basically nothing that I write in English ever gets read in Korea. Our Korean colleagues all go through a number of kind of examinations testing their English, and all of the best researchers in Korea have gone through any number of really difficult English language examinations. And so in theory, read English just fine, and maybe they do, but in practice they don't. And they sort of, it would never occur to them that a foreigner would have anything useful to say. Now that they have lots of money in Korea, they're very happy to invite non-ethnic Koreans to Korea to come there and give them guest lecturers so they can say they're internationalized, but you'll never see them actually engaging with or citing foreign researchers in more traditional areas of Korean studies. So in that sense, my positionality, it doesn't really help or hurt me. In some ways it's liberating because I know that no matter what I write, they're just not gonna read it. Unless someone translates it into Korean for them. I don't normally publish in Korean because I feel that would be a huge waste of my training. And my job is to interpret Korea to people back in North America in English. So that's one aspect of positionality that I suppose helps, just in the sense that I'm not subject to the same intense nationalist pressures that scholars back in Korea are, where they cannot write a line without their supervisor going through their bibliography and saying, "이거 빼, 이 사람 빼." They make sure they don't cite anybody from a rival school or something. It's very conservative that way, and I'm just not part of that. So that's liberating. The other part, which isn't really answering your question the way you phrased it, One thing that was also helpful, it was not so much that I am not a native speaker of Korean, but that I happened to have learned Russian to a fairly high level already in high school. And it was completely by accident in 1984 when I was at a conference in Uzbekistan. It had nothing to do with Korean linguistics. I went out behind the hotel and there was a big bazaar and I saw Korean women selling kimchi. I said, what the hell are these Korean women doing here? And I started talking to one of the ladies and I couldn't understand a word she was saying. And so I thought, oh, this is bizarre. And so nobody from the Kugo, or the National Language Studies field in Korea, knows Russian, and certainly didn't know Russian back then. So even if they wanted to do this kind of research, they couldn't. Or if they did, they could only, well, this one thing that did help me in terms of positionality by being a foreigner was that I could actually go to the Soviet Union. South Koreans could not go until probably 1993 or 4. I mean, after 1992 when the Soviet Union fell. And I had already been there, since 1986 back and forth. So I kind of had that kind of advantage, which was just an accident of citizenship. But even so, I mean, again, it gets back to this idea that if you do Kugo Hak and you're a Korean, the assumption is all I need to know is Korean. And they don't bother, and so they don't know Russian. They don't really read English, even though they take lots of exams in it. And so their view, I think, is very narrow. And so I guess that's an advantage I had, but yeah. Sorry for the long answer. Yeah.
Hello. So when I was in Korea, I met this girl that she spoke Koremari.
Oh.
Yeah, but a very, very simplified version of it. She was studying there for her degree in undergraduate program, but she felt like she was half Korean and half Russian, I think. But she didn't, Koreans didn't made her feel like she was Korean.
Right.
So she had to relearn how to speak
Right.
Korean.
Right.
And also her intonation and the speed and the speech and the tone, they were very different from
Right.
Koreans.
Sure.
So she had to relearn. So my question is there any possibility to revive, if I can say that, this dialect? Even though I know, and as you said, they are very reluctant to varieties.
I got asked that question a lot from the moment I started field work by Koryo-saram themselves. So how can we revive our language? Because they do. In my experience, the Koryo-saram think of Koremari in kind of the same way that Jews in the United States think about Yiddish. It's a really comfortable place to go, but it's increasingly difficult to get there. So, it's this. It's more of an idea now than an actual spoken language. I don't think it's realistic to revive it. You're absolutely right that Koreans themselves have a very low tolerance level for other forms of Korean, and this is why North Korean defectors, one of their biggest obstacles is learning how to sound like a South Korean, and why the Koreans from Yeonbyeon who are working in all these restaurants, that they have to change the way they talk and so on. Koreans are just very unforgiving that way, even of their sort of so-called co-ethnics. It reminds me of a story. Actually, literally just this morning, I got this it made me feel old. I got an email out of the blue this morning from Yuna Shigai. So many of the Soviet Koreans have surnames that take a regular Korean surname and add gai at the end, and you can tell right away that it's a Koryo-saram. So she's Seoshi, it'd be Seo. So Shigai, Yuna Shigai. She says, "Dear Professor King, I am a junior at UCLA in Los Angeles, and am a Koryo-saram. And my father told me recently that my great-grandmother was interviewed by an English-speaking linguist in St. Petersburg in the 1980s about her dialect. Was that you? Her name is Maria so-and-so." I was like, "Tiocha Maria, I remember her." So it's coming back, and it's like, whoa. And it's like, 40 years ago. And so I guess that's what I'm trying to say there is I have kind of hoped for the longest time that somebody like that, a young Soviet Korean, a young Koremari, would show up at my door in Vancouver and say, you know, hey, I want to study this stuff, because I've got like 100 audio CDs of my interviews with these old ladies that I haven't even transcribed. And, you know, it's a lot of work, and I need help. And, you know, it's someone from that community should be doing this. The problem is that all the really smart, you know, ambitious Koryo-saram young people, they're not going to become academics. They got better things to do. They go into business, they become lawyers, they become doctors. And so anyway, there is an increasing number of Koryo-saram that are now living outside of the former Soviet Union, because in a way, with the fall of the Soviet Union, they have no reason to be there anymore, because the fact they don't speak Kazakh, they don't speak Uzbek, and in those places, if you don't speak those languages, you can't get jobs now. So they're in Canada, you know, they're in the United States, maybe there's some in Italy, I don't know. But so that's sounds like you met someone along those lines, and yeah, and you mentioned that she has different accent. Yeah. So the Koremari, because it's a Hamgyong, it's because its roots are in Hamgyong dialect, it has pitch accent. It has distinctive highs and lows, just as Gyeongsang dialect does, except all the highs and lows are in different places. And they're actually in the same places as they are in 15th century Korean. So it's got that. It has all these features that basically, once you get to Korea, the Koreans stamp them out of you, beat them out of you, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. It was really very, very interesting. And I think it was an incredible example of Stalin's policy, especially Stalin's policy with nationalities and languages. I really I didn't know, I knew about the deportation, but I didn't know about Soviet Korean, and it was really very, very interesting. And it is maybe a peculiar case because you made some examples. For example, Azerbaijan, which was created an identity, was given an identity, and also a territory, and that was, of course, was going to create so many problems, of course, as we know very well with Armenia and so on. So it's like an artificial language identity and so on, and history as well, cultural history. So, and of course, this is quite different case because, of course, we didn't get a territory. No. Because it was very serious political reasons, geopolitical reasons, but it's very clear. And, well, I would like to ask, because I was making some research with Russian and Chinese language relations, but not in the Soviet era, just in the 18th and 19th centuries. Okay. And I was, well, I studied a little, but I didn't get deep into this issue about the Rusko-Kitaisky dialect, which was like a pidgin, and which was a very interesting phenomenon. So I wonder whether there were some pidgins, also Korean, Russian, and also about the Soviet Korean, apart from this lexical realia or loans from Soviet Russian especially. There were other influences also from syntaxes or something like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm familiar with some of the research on the Russo-Chinese pidgin, and I have to say I have not seen anything similar for Korean, which doesn't mean that there wasn't such a thing, but I have not encountered written sources that refer to anything like that. So yeah, I think the short answer there is I haven't seen it for a Korean Russian pidgin. In terms of other kinds of contact-induced changes, I mean, there is some research trying to show ways in which Koremari, the Soviet Korean, incorporated loans here and there from either Kazakh or Uzbek after the deportation. But it's actually pretty skimpy because most of the Koreans never bothered to learn the languages of the republics to which they were deported. They instead excelled in Russian. And one of the sort of refrains that my wife and I always heard when we were there in the 80s and early 90s was the Koreans would always say, we have the highest sort of tertiary education rate of any ethnic group in the Soviet Union, like counted as the number of kandidat degrees. And then they would go on and say, even more than the Jews. And this was the point. They were very proud of their high levels of educational achievement, which in some ways is true across the Korean diaspora, right? And so they were very, very proud of their Russian, but they were also very proud of not learning Kazakh or Uzbek and so on. I am not aware of any really good data that would show that they were, say, taking in anything from like local Tungusic languages in Manchuria before the deportation. Most of them didn't even speak Russian. You know, they were just in their farming communities. So it's really hard to find good contact data of that nature for Soviet Korean. It's mostly all about its interactions with Russian and the way, and there's still a lot of research to be done in the way that Soviet Korean interacted with Russian, and that hasn't really been written yet, I'm afraid. Yes, please. By the way, you should tell your friend to contact me.
Okay, I will do that. So earlier you were talking about Korea not having a standard language.
About what?
About Korea not having a standard language, like a unified language. I agree in sense that North and South Korean, they are very different. So in that sense, I do agree that they don't have a standard language, like a standardified. Did I get it right?
Yeah, that's
okay.
that's what I was saying. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's also a question that, depending on who you ask, patriotic sentiment will trump facts. You know, in other words, oh, we're all Koreans, it's okay. Yeah, we have a few different words. But there was the famous episode back in, I think, 1972. So after 1948, official sort of division. And then until 1972, representatives of North and South Korea never literally met officially. And then in 1972, there was this meeting at Panmunjom, and then all the headlines were, oh my God, we speak a different language, which of course they didn't, but they had already started to notice these differences. And then, of course, on the South, they basically blamed it on the North, because the North undertook this very aggressive, or maybe aggressive is the wrong word, this very enterprising policy of trying to get rid of loanwords, trying to get rid of Hanjao, trying to replace them with neologisms that were based in Korean, and making up all these new words, and some of them stick, some of them don't. And so the Koreans are like, oh, you guys have changed our language. In the South, in the meantime, in the South, they're all speaking English, right? So it's both sides have been diverging, yeah.
Any other question? No?
If I may ask a question, I was wondering, you mentioned when you showed that letter from that woman who had just learned how to write, and you said that her name was Varvara Lee.
Yes.
So I was wondering, what was the policy about naming customs for Korean people in the Soviet Union? Like, was it usual for people already back then to have Russian names?
It was, in fact, it already was usual back into the 1880s and 1890s, because a certain percentage of the Koreans living in the Russian Far East, even before Soviet times, had earned Russian citizenship, and one of the conditions to do so was to adopt Russian Orthodox religion. In order to do that, you had to have a Russian name. So most of them already by the turn of the century, if they were, at least if they had Russian citizenship, had a Russian given name and a patronymic, although that patronymic might be a Korean name, like let's say the person's name is like Shagai, this like the woman I just mentioned who wrote me. Let's say you have a Shagai Vladimir Kilamovich. So they would have a Korean name and then the patronymic. And you still see that today with a number of Soviet Koreans. But the norm already by the time of the revolution was Korean surname, although it could be a kind of very sort of Koryos Haram type one with the guy on it. And then a Russian name and then a patronymic, but it could be Ivanovna or Ivanovich or a Korean, a Korean name plus the ovich. Yeah, it was pretty standard. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Hello. It's just a curiosity of mine. I was wondering, do you plan in the future to maybe write a manual about all this information you have, or is it not enough sources?
I mean, I'm drowning in data and keep waiting for this magical Koryos Haram student to show up at my door. I mean, I haven't even published my dissertation as a book yet, and that was 1991. And it's since grown to 2 big volumes, and that might come out in the next 4 or 5 years if I live. But my dialect data, the stuff that I collected from the old ladies, that's a tough one. I might have to just donate all those materials to the Hangul Pangbulgwan in Korea, and then hope that they'll do something with it. I don't know.
Would be a shame that everything gets
well, but let me tell you this. I mean, the problem is, first of all, I'm easily distracted, so I've got all these other projects too. But when you're doing dialect work, let's say you have 1 minute of recorded, audio tape. The ratio to get 1 minute of recording onto the computer, glossed out, transcribed, is about 60 to 1. So it takes you an hour to do 1 minute of transcription. And I've got literally 100 of these audio CDs of different Haimani's telling me stories or answering questionnaires, and it's just too daunting. And when you're having to teach your classes and start a new program, as you know, it's just there's only so many hours in the day, and so it keeps falling onto the back burner. But I agree, it would be a shame. I'm just hoping it'll be my project for retirement. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Other question? Okay. I have a question.
Of course.
First, it was quite difficult for me because I'm Korean. I'm in this moment the unique native speaker of Korean language.
In the room, yes, you are. Yes, you are.
But at the same time, it was quite difficult to follow the reading of Korean before. But I noticed there is also the similarity between Koremari and some dialect of Gangwon-do, because my grandma was always using her dialect. For example, Jimche, she was using continuously this word. I understand now finally, and they have the strong influence from Koremari. But in Italy we have actually very numerous dialects, and in Korea some dialects, but unfortunately many dialects are disappearing because it's not used anymore. And the title of your lecture is also Endangered Korean Dialects. It's a great big loss. I'm wondering if you had the occasion to do the interview or to meet some Korean or for your research, because I think because this is the more than 10 years ago, so I think among young people this dialect is not used anymore, so it's a big loss. So I'm wondering how many people in Russian and this part are actually using Korea dialect, Koremari dialect.
Today?
Yeah, today.
Oh, I mean,
People in the 40s or 50s?
no, I mean, so
not
think of
anymore.
it this way. When I was looking for my interlocutors in the 1980s and 1990s, I was looking for Koreans who were born before the deportation, so before 1937. Of course, now such people, even if they were born before 1937, you know, they're going to be they're going to be almost 90 years old. And there are some, but then, you know, even then, you know, you would meet someone, or I'm asking, and I was especially looking specifically for Koreans who spoke this one sort of minority dialect that was really conservative. And even Soviet Koreans themselves were aware of this special dialect, but they thought it was a speech defect, not realizing it was actually a particular region way up north. And like, oh yeah, there's, because they speak. There was the word for store was kongni-sha, right? So in older Korean, they would write sha and sa would be different syllables. In this dialect, they keep that distinction, sha and sha. So they say, oh, those are the Koreans that go sha, 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 sha. So I would always say, do you know any old ladies who babushki katori shakayu, who say sha? And they go, oh yeah, there's a babushka like that down the street. And then you'd go down there and you'd meet the babushka, and either she would be like demented, you know, in which case, no, you can't really do an interview. So many of them had dementia, or they didn't have any of their teeth left. And so sometimes they would pronounce a certain way because they didn't have their teeth. And then it was really hard to find an actual, you know, clear-minded speaker born before 1937 who spoke this one dialect. The other dialect, fine, there's lots of speakers. And then it also emerged that the best speakers, the place where it survived better was in Uzbekistan on collective farms where the dominant population was Korean. And in fact, in Uzbekistan, you would meet people of other ethnic groups who were fluent speakers of Koremari because they grew up on a Korean dominant collective farm, which is really interesting. And if you can look right now on YouTube, there's a wonderful documentary called Koryosaram, which you can easily see on YouTube, which starts off, you hear, all you see is this kind of road going on for miles and miles and miles in the desert, and then someone singing a song in Koremari, and then talking in Koremari, and then eventually you see the face, and it's a Ukrainian woman who was brought up by, Koryosaram. And then the whole movie is about a Kazakh guy who's a fluent speaker, a Kurdish woman, and they're all speaking fluent, really good Koremari. And so Koremari was in some ways an inter-ethnic language of communication, in certain circumstances on collective farms. And so for me, these collective farms, because they were all farmers, right, in the Far East. And so one of the reasons they were brought to Central Asia was to kickstart agriculture, especially Kazakhs didn't know anything. Kazakhs don't know how to grow watermelons. They're nomads. And so basically, you all know about the Aral Sea, right? The Aral Sea dried up, right? Well, part of the reason it dried up was because the Koreans were brought to to Uzbekistan to grow two things, rice and cotton, the two most water-intensive crops you can imagine, and it was the Koreans who did that because they were told to by the Soviets. So anyway, I'm getting off topic, but to go back to your original question, it was already the reason I stopped doing field work in 2005 was I was finding that it was really difficult to find fluent first language speakers that were not already kind of infected by Russian, and the other reason I stopped was that Koremari itself was becoming heavily infected by South Korean, because as soon as the Soviet Union fell, the first South Koreans that went into Central Asia were evangelical missionaries who immediately went in and set up churches and started teaching these Koreans South Korean, and simultaneously teaching them that the language that they spoke was not correct, that it was dirty, and that it was just not something they should be speaking. And so I kept running into these Koryosaram who had this really negative kind of attitude about their native language, due in large part to contact with South Koreans. And after the evangelical missionaries, it was the South Korean businessmen who immediately started hiring them and similarly telling them, "You're Korean, that's not Korean, that's bullshit, speak standard Korean." And so a good example of what you had mentioned earlier of these kind of really discriminatory attitudes on the part of Koreans to their co-ethnics, especially linguistically. It's really hard to, so basically, no, it's really hard to find first language speakers. In 2005, I found some speakers who were really good up to a point. So they're in the literature on language death talks about semi-speakers. So semi-speakers they speak it to a certain extent, usually because they're taking care of an older parent who was the first speaker. And I did meet quite a few of those. But and then I started meeting women or speakers who I had already met 10 years ago and had said, "Oh, this person's not good enough." And so I gave up. It's not to say that it's dead. Some young people, there are certain words around the house, again, like Yiddish. There's certain Yiddish, Jews will know certain Yiddish words, and they find comfort in them, especially for food. Things like food and kinship terms, they'll use those. But to have a kind of coherent conversation, they can't. Yeah. Yes?
This is really not about language or Korean dialect. I was a little curious if you know about literature on this experience, very painful, and this deportation, because of course there was so much production, especially from the 90s in Russia, when it became Russia again, about experiences in Stalinism. And so I was wondering whether there is a literature about, because I really don't know, and I wonder, I think maybe it is in Russian, from memories of people. So just to know.
Yeah, there is, but it's in Russian. There are no Koryosaram producing literature in Korean. They write in Russian. And so the documentary I just mentioned called Koryosaram, the filmmaker was actually, the person who made that film was the first writer, and he's Koryosaram himself. He was the first Koryosaram writer to broach the topic of the deportation in a short story that he wrote just at the end of Perestroika in 1989. And since then, there's quite a bit, but it's all in Russian.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. We'll meet him again on this Monday, so mi raccomando.